Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining with us this evening. Hope you find the presentations and the discussion this evening useful for your farm business. My name is David Wright. I'm the Northern Ireland editor of the Farmers Journal. And can I thank the organisers tonight, CAFRE, AFBI, the UFU, the NBA, LMC and NIMEA for inviting me to take part. And with that many organisations involved, I'm glad I wasn't on the planning committee for the event. But fair play to those organisers for holding this webinar on a wet day, so none of us have any need to rush out to get to cover the silage pit or sow fertiliser, etc. So everything has fallen into place okay. This is the first of 4 webinars focusing on solutions that can be employed to further increase sustainability of the Northern Ireland beef industry. The first webinar tonight will consider how to maximise production efficiency on farms. A second webinar on the 17th of June, and there'll be a bit of detail on that later on, will address the issue of building financial resilience into beef production systems. While 2 further webinars later on in the autumn will look at environmental sustainability on farms and how, as a beef industry, we respond to future consumer demands. So our first event tonight is under the heading Grass, Your Greatest Asset, with speakers from AFBI and CAFRE. And we'll round off with Kilkeel beef and sheep farmer James Henderson. So please note that this event this evening will be recorded and a link will be sent to you afterwards, so you can watch it again if you so wish. Please don't be shy, and if you have any questions as we go through the presentations, please submit them via the Q&A button or icon on your screen. Don't use the chat function, use the Q&A button, please. I'll do my best to pull them together at the end, but if there's anything that's outstanding, we will get those answered and forward on to you as well. So please do engage as the progresses. There will be a survey at the end, which the organisers would greatly appreciate if you would take the time to complete. And I promise to finish it at 9:30 on the dot. So please ask all our speakers to try and stick to their allotted time as best they can. So our first speaker this evening is Dr. Suzanne Higgins from AFBI. Suzanne's a soil scientist. She will look at the importance of managing your soil to make the best and most efficient and cost-effective use of nutrients. So I'm going to hand over to you, Suzanne. So thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Suzanne Higgins. I'm a soil scientist at AFBI. So tonight I'm going to be talking about soil and nutrient management for optimum forage production. Sorry, this screen's not moving on. Hold on a wee second. Okay, so soil is one of the most important assets on a farm. So a healthy soil will support grass growth. It will also have good drainage and be resilient. So what are the optimum soil conditions for growing grass? So essentially this depends on your farm type. So I'm going to be talking about the main nutrients and getting the balance of the nutrients right. So I'll be talking about nitrogen, phosphorus, potash and sulfur, and I'll also be talking about lime. So first of all, nitrogen. So nitrogen is the most important nutrient and it's also the hardest to manage. Potentially you could lose 30 to 50% of the nitrogen you apply depending on the conditions. So how much nitrogen do you need? So this depends on the intensity of your management. So there are some farms which are managed intensively. So they are applying the upper limit of the nitrogen allowance. And these farms would have high target yields of around 12 to 16 tonnes of dry matter per hectare per year. And they generally would be aiming for around 3 silage cuts. Then there are a lot of more extensively managed farms where the manure inputs would be less than 120 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. And they're maybe only putting on 60 kilograms of chemical nitrogen per hectare per year. So these farms would have a lot lower target yields of around 4 to 7 tonnes of dry matter per hectare per year. And this is enough silage generally for their needs. They maybe are only taking 1 or 2 silage cuts. And a large part of Northern Ireland is managed more extensively. So not everybody is aiming for the 12 tonne of dry matter per hectare per year. So the key for your nitrogen is to be putting on as much as you need for your target yields. So slurry is a really valuable source of nutrients. You want to make the most of your slurry nutrients. It's a really important source of nitrogen and also P and K, especially if you apply it in the springtime. So the best thing is to get your slurry out early in the spring to get the nutrients into the soil. And slurry can provide a large proportion of the nutrients you need for first cut silage. So we are encouraging low trajectory spreading techniques such as trailing shoe. So trailing shoe will improve your nitrogen use efficiency and it can increase yields by 25%. So fertilizer nitrogen is also a really important source of nitrogen. The problem with fertilizer nitrogen is quite easily lost from soil. So it can be washed through the soil or it can be lost up into the atmosphere as nitrous oxide, which is a greenhouse gas, or ammonia. And most of the loss of nitrogen will occur in the 3 or 4 days immediately after you apply the fertilizer. So the graph at the bottom here, this is some work we did at AFBI where we applied fertilizer 3 times a year. So the very first application, if you can see the dates along the bottom axis, when fertilizer was applied early in April, the weather conditions were good. So there was actually very little loss of nitrogen then. This nitrous oxide emissions. And then by the third application in July, there was heavy rain 2 or 3 days following the fertilizer application, and there's huge losses of nitrous oxide. So we looked at different forms of the nitrogen fertilizer and different rates applied. So the higher the rate applied, the more you could potentially lose as nitrous oxide. So CAN had the greatest losses of nitrous oxide. Now, if you put on urea, you would tend to get loss as ammonia. You can use protected urea where there's an inhibitor, and this will reduce ammonia losses. And we have found very little difference really in the yield between CAN urea or protected urea. Currently, protected urea would be slightly more expensive than ordinary urea. It would be currently slightly cheaper than CAN. So in summary then for your nitrogen, avoid applying fertilizer or slurry if there's heavy rain forecast in the next few days because you could lose a lot of that nitrogen. Avoid applying slurry on warm windy days because you could get increased ammonia loss. So the best conditions for applying your slurry would be dull overcast days. It doesn't matter, maybe a little drizzle, that's okay if you're applying slurry. So if there's a period of drought, don't apply any more nitrogen. So if there's a drought period, the grass will stop growing and the nitrogen won't be taken up because nitrogen needs moisture to be taken up by the grass. So if you get a period of drought, don't apply any more nitrogen and then take that nitrogen into account for your next application. So generally there would be a flush of growth upon re-wetting. So if you have a drought period and then you get rain, you tend to get compensatory growth after that. And we saw in 2018, we had a very dry summer. And then the following winter, there was bumper growth because there was residual nitrogen left in the soil. And this can increase the growth a few months later. So now I'm going to talk about phosphorus. So historically in Northern Ireland, too much phosphorus has been applied. So recent soil sampling schemes have shown that 50% of soils in Northern Ireland contain too much phosphorus. So this is phosphorus which is above what is required for production. And when you have high phosphorus in the soil, there's increased risk of phosphorus loss into waterways. So how much phosphorus do you need? So if you get a soil test, you're aiming for index 2 for phosphorus. In the recent Nitrates Action Programme, the 2019 revision, the phosphorus recommendations have been revised. So the index 2 has been split into a 2- and a 2+. The 2- is a new recommendations which would be recommended for more extensively managed grassland. So it would be the lower end of index 2, whereas if you're managing more intensively, your soil can be at the upper end of index 2. So in an extensively managed system, the lower rate of nitrogen applied is generally a limiting factor for growth. So if you're putting on less nitrogen, your yields that you can actually attain are going to be lower. So that's why you'd maybe only be getting 7 tonne of dry matter per hectare per year because of the lower nitrogen input. Even if you apply more phosphorus in these systems, your yields won't increase anymore because nitrogen is limiting the overall growth. So where if you're a lower nitrogen input system, your phosphorus uptake will be lower and your phosphorus requirement will be lower. So you can have a lower phosphorus index for your soil. So your soil could be sitting around index 1, index 2 minus, and that'll be enough phosphorus that you need. Whereas if you're managing more intensively and putting on more nitrogen and taking maybe 3 cuts of silage, your soil can sit with higher phosphorus in it because you're going to use more, and you need that higher phosphorus for your yields. If your soil test shows index 3 or above for phosphorus, you don't need to be putting any more phosphorus on because it's not going to be needed for growth and it'll just build up in the soil and potentially be lost into rivers. So the summary for phosphorus then, it's really important. Test your soil every 4 to 5 years and only apply the phosphorus you need. So if you're grazing fields, your target would be a 2 minus. And for silage ground, you can aim for a slightly higher phosphorus index up to the upper end of index 2. So too much phosphorus is harmful for the environment, particularly local water quality. But if your phosphorus is low or showing deficiency, you need to apply phosphorus. So it is required for yield. So if you need it, you need to put it on. Now I'm going to talk about potash. So potash improves your nitrogen use efficiency. So again, test your soil and you're aiming again for index 2 for potash. K deficiency can reduce your yields by 20%. So it's really important on silage fields to have enough potash in them. The only time you might need to be concerned about too much potash is if it's a grazed field in the springtime. So high inputs of potash can contribute to the development of grass tetany in suckler cows. So if you have a grazed field, just be wary about putting on too much potash, particularly in the springtime. And then sulfur. So sulfur deficiency is a big problem in Northern Ireland, and you can lose yields by up to 30%. So sulfur is quite like nitrogen and it's very easily washed out of the soil. It can also result in a reduced feeding value of the grass. So slurry won't apply all the sulfur you need. So you sort of need to put on nitrogen sulfur fertilizer, particularly in the spring. You might only need it for the first application and you mightn't need it even every year. You might need it every other year, but it's particularly for that spring application. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about lime. So the target soil pH is pH 6 to 6.2. So this is optimum for perennial ryegrass and white clover swards. More than 50% of grassland in Northern Ireland requires lime, and you could be losing up to 2 tonne of dry matter per hectare per year. So you should apply lime regularly and try and maintain your pH rather than letting the pH fall and then having to put on a load of lime maybe every 8 to 10 years. You're better putting it on every 3 to 4 years. Lime will improve the utilisation of all other nutrients, so it's really important to put on lime regularly. It's very difficult to know when to put on lime, and this is a difficulty for farmers. What's the best time in the year to put on lime and to get enough a window of opportunity to put it on. So if you put lime on in spring, the key thing is not to apply nitrogen too close to that lime application. You need at least 4 weeks after lime before you put on your nitrogen because it would increase ammonia loss. So the best time maybe to apply your lime would be in the late summer or the autumn and let that lime dissolve in the soil over the winter. So then the take home messages for me would be test your soil every 4 to 5 years, only apply the nutrients you need and for your target yields. You don't need to focus totally on nitrogen and phosphorus. Potash, sulfur and lime are equally important. And make sure these are an optimum supply for your grassland. And in terms of nitrogen, better to apply it when there's the most growth and always keep an eye on the weather when putting on nitrogen because you risk losing it from your system and that's a loss of valuable nitrogen from the system. Okay, thank you. So I'm happy to answer any questions in the question and answer at the end.
Okay, Suzanne, thank you for that. We will certainly have a few questions there coming through already for you. So thank you. Our second speaker is actually an ex-colleague of mine, Dr. David Patterson from AFBI. We used to work together at Greenmount Road. David's a lot older than I am. Sorry, David. David will consider how, as farmers, we can build resilience in the grassland, and with a particular focus on clover. So, David, over to you, and sorry for the insult.
I'll pass on from that one, David. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm David Patterson, as David said, and I'm the AFBI Grassland agronomist based at AFBI Hillsborough. So tonight I want to talk about building resilience into our grass swards. And if you can move on, please, Heather. So what exactly do I mean by building resilience into grassland? And as you can see there from the pendulum graphic, it's all about trying to achieve the balance between productivity and environmental impact. Productivity on the left side is your sward performance, your animal performance, your overall farm system performance and productivity. But how does that weigh out against the environmental impact in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, ammonia emissions, and the all-important carbon footprint? And what I want to focus on tonight at the bottom photograph here is how can we use species diversity in our swards to deliver more sustainable grassland as we go forward. Thank you. And species diversity, again, what do I actually mean by that? The photograph on the left-hand side is a good, healthy grass clover sward. Also good, if you notice, the bees are in there, good for pollinators and a whole host of insects. The photograph on the right-hand side is going a little stage further in terms of diversity by introducing species of herbs and other legumes into the equation. So a richer diversity yet again. And another step beyond that actually would be to bring in some of the trees. Just go back one, Heather, please. Would be to bring in some of the trees into that right-hand photograph, which would add even more species diversity. But tonight I want to focus on the grass clover on the left-hand side. Thank you. So just to remind us what we're actually talking about, the photograph up on the top left-hand side is a relatively young juvenile white clover plant. And you can tell that by it's still quite a bunched root form there. And you can see straight away there's lots of very digestible green leaf and tissue there with even some flower heads showing already. The photograph on the bottom of the slide shows you what we're really after, which is much more matured plant. And that's what we need to see in a thriving, healthy grass clover sward. Some of the organic farmers' fields that I've looked at over the years, you reach down into the base of the sward and you will see these stolons as they're labeled there on the photograph. I should say on that photograph at the bottom, the right-hand side would be the original juvenile plant, the original seedling, if you want to call it that, but it will grow through the sward horizontally using these horizontally growing stems called stolons. And if you work your way right the way across to the left-hand side of the photograph, you'll see there's more leaves being produced there too, but there's the all-important growing points. And it's the stolons and the growing points which allow the plant to survive in the long term. It's easy to get a strike of grass clover and a reseed and have lots of clover leaf at the top of the canopy, but what will survive in the long term are these rope-like stolons creeping along the top of the soil. Next slide, please. So in terms of improving diversity of clover, what I want to cover quickly is basically 5 questions. First of all, well, why should be farmers even consider or reconsider grass clover right now? How do these swards stack up? How do they perform? And what's their environmental impact? And if that's all great, well, why aren't they using more grass clover right now? And finishing off with some tips on management of grass clover and how to establish it. Thank you. So the first of those, why should farmers reconsider grass clover right now? Well, the background point I would put up straight away is the the rising input prices. You've seen yourselves the hike in fertilizer prices this year, up approximately £50 a tonne for straight nitrogen, but also feed and fuel. The only way is north with those prices. And Clover, second point, can substitute some of that chemical, that fertilizer nitrogen, can substitute that with atmospherically fixed nitrogen. And looking across a whole host of research papers, the average I can come up with is about 150 kilograms of nitrogen fixed per hectare per year. And that's free nitrogen. That's the equivalent of about 138 units of fertilizer nitrogen per acre in old money. Third point there, the clover itself is ideal for grazing swards. It's because of those stolons you saw in the previous photograph that it can creep through, and its horizontal nature of growth complements very well with the more upright, erect form of growth with perennial ryegrass. And finally, important from the animal point of view, higher dry matter intakes. Whenever you have a healthy population of about 20% in the dry matter of clover. Why? Because there's basically less fiber, higher protein, and also higher levels of P and K taken up into the tissue. So it's a much more digestible material than the grass that it grows alongside. Thank you. Second question, how do grass clover swards perform in beef farming systems? And again, did a quick mini review of the literature for tonight's talk, and the important point about the grass clover type research studies over the years, and some of these studies are going back quite a few years, there was sufficient longevity in the trials. A lot of the multi-species swards research, which I'm also involved in at the moment, is still relatively young, still relatively short-lived in terms of the span of time that we've been looking at that. Whereas these studies over the years, the first one was an AFBI trial, 4-year study with beef cattle, the stock carrying capacity of an established grass clover sward with only a tactical 50 kilograms of nitrogen in the spring, carried the same amount of stock, or sorry, it carried 86% of the same amount of stock on a grass-only sward with 360 kilograms of nitrogen, which is a mighty difference in terms of the nitrogen input. Similar study from Moore Park, they had a 5-year study, similar kind of story, even more extreme, a 0 amount of nitrogen fertilizer going on to a healthy grass clover sward, stock carrying capacity had the equivalent of 85% of the comparable grass only sward with 400 kilograms of nitrogen this time. Then there were 3 studies came across from Grange over the years, and they had finishing steers grazing grass clover with 50 kilograms of nitrogen, producing over 90% of the carcass gain of what will be achieved on a grass only sward with 220 kilograms of nitrogen. So I think that the short answer there is yes, these grass clover swards can perform in beef farming situations. Okay. But think back to the pendulum. What's the balance then with the environmental impact of all of that performance and productivity, etc.? Well, first and foremost, it's free nitrogen. The rhizobia, the little nodules and the roots of the white clover, and you can dig a cube of that up very quickly with the corner of the spade. And if you see little pink pin-sized nodules on the roots, you know that your clover is actively fixing nitrogen. It's not just there soaking up available nitrogen, it's fixing it from the atmosphere, making it available for grass growth. And importantly, from the environmental calculations, that fixed nitrogen is now considered as carbon and energy neutral. When it comes to the question mark of greenhouse gases, well, yes, there will be a much reduced use of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer on these swards, so there will be less opportunity for nitrous oxide emissions when you compare it with grass plus nitrogen fertilizer. And finally, the carbon footprint. There was an AFBI trial done, it's over 10 years ago now. There was a life cycle analysis, which basically means they take all of the inputs and outputs of the systems and calculate out the carbon footprint. In this case, it was dairy origin beef finishing systems, and they compared a grass clover system with a grass plus grass only sward with 150 kilograms of nitrogen over the year, and they found that there was a 19% reduction in the carbon footprint on the grass clover system. So again, it's a yes in terms of improving the environmental impact. Thank you. That's all very well. That sounds very good so far. So why don't farmers right now rely more on grass clover swards? And the sort of feedback that you'll get is, well, it's a different management system required, and it's obviously simpler to apply, just go out and apply nitrogen fertilizer to grass-only swards. And I have some sympathies with that. It is easier. Unreliable spring yields of clover, can't deny it. The clover has got a higher temperature threshold for growth in the spring than grass has. So those couple of degrees of difference do make a difference. But there's ways of managing your way around this. And there's also the perception of poor clover persistency. And again, yes, in some of the trials over the years, the long-term trials, there has been instances where there's been a sudden dip in the clover performance and maybe didn't come back for sometimes hard to explain reasons. But again, with overseeding and other methods, there's ways of dealing with that situation if it arises. And it isn't guaranteed to happen. Thank you. So how to put a positive view on this? What can we do to positively manage white clover and maintain that? Thinking back to that photograph early on, how do we get those matured, high persistency clover plants to survive in the sward? Well, basically it's reduce the fertilizer nitrogen. And I could probably stop the talk there, but we can also add in some what I call tactical nitrogen in the spring. If the grass is going to grow sooner than clover in the spring, you need herbage there to turn the cattle out onto in the spring. With a tactical use of 50 kilograms or up to 50 kilograms of nitrogen, you can get that grass to grow, but the proviso is get it grazed off quickly and efficiently and allow the light to get back down into the base of the sward to stimulate the clover to branch and contribute for the rest of the summer when clover delivers more productivity. And as Suzanne was referring to earlier, even more important with grass clover swards, you need to have the soil pH and the indexes at the right level. In terms of grazing management, there's a couple of tips there. It's been shown in various trials over the years, the swards need to be grazed down tightly, especially through that April, May, June period. There's opportunity in the middle part of the growing season to relax that a little bit, both in terms of grazing residual and in terms of number of days until you come back to graze. The rotation length, simply because it allows clover to build up some reserves back into those stolons. And another watchword here is to avoid continuous grazing, especially with sheep, because of reported problems over the years of selective grazing and repeated close grazing can reduce the persistency of the clover. Another watchword is for autumn defoliation, where we must graze off cleanly in the late part of the autumn, early winter. Ideally, avoid poaching when doing that, of course, but maintain a high clover content, or the consequences is that you can maintain a high degree of clover contribution in the following spring. And my own research some years back showed that to basically answer the question, how does that work? Well, it's because they ended up with a greater degree of stolon branching and more of those clover growing points coming into the spring, which then delivered more clover productivity the following spring. Thank you. So in terms of practical tips, how do we, if you're convinced so far, well, maybe I should try clover again or try it for the first time, how to establish it into the sward. The left-hand side, we can consider full conventional plough, cultivate and reseed. That comes at a cost. Or some of the, on the right-hand side, some of the reduced cost or minimum tillage type techniques, or even overseeding into an existing sward without any surface preparation. Next slide. So how to get that establishment going? First point I should make is regarding timing. There's been a host again of papers over the years looking at the success or otherwise of different timings of sowing of clover seed. On balance, I would always steer back towards spring, early summer. In an ordinary year, that would have been April, not this year because there was very little growth, too cold, too wet, or too cold and too dry. This particular April, but maybe May this year is the year to go with it. Why go early? simply because it allows the clover plants, especially them, to have the long summer days to get properly established before you get into the cooler, wetter time of year. Yes, you can get a good strike on a grass clover sward sowing in the latter part of the summer or the early autumn, and you will get clover leaves coming up to the top of the canopy, but you probably won't get the development of the plant down deeper into the soil surface where all the stolon activity is. So you want a good robust plant going into that first winter. In terms of conventional establishment, as you saw in the photograph, it involves burning off and ploughing, and that's probably still, in terms of percentage success, is probably the highest in terms of successfully getting a grass clover sward established. But the advice there is to watch in terms of broadcasting or shallow drilling, not to put the seed in any deeper than a centimetre. So it's really at or near the surface, and it's all about roll. It's roll, roll, roll before and after to ensure we get good seed soil contact. Oversowing allows an opportunity at much lower cost to establish clover into an existing grass sward. Let's say you've got a sward that's still got maybe at least 50% of the sown grass is still there. There's maybe reasons why you can't or don't want to plough in a particular field. As long as you may be able to see in that photograph on the right, as long as you can get enough bare soil, if you can look into the sward from above and see plenty of bare soil surface, then you can overseed successfully. Other watchwords, you have to make sure you address any weed issues first. If there's a dock problem or a major chickweed problem or something like that, address those issues before you start. Reduce the competition, and the best opportunity to do this is after a silage or a hay cut or something like that, where you've got a nice clean open stubble and you can see lots of the soil surface, because that's where you're trying to get the clover to strike. So get the seed in. Doesn't have to be with one of these air seeders with spring tines, but they are very effective. They will place the seed in at the surface very, very well. What you don't want to do is scarify the surface too much, because sometimes that can actually just trigger lots of the resident dock seedlings and everything else that's in there. It can only stimulate them to germinate. So you just want to go in with minimal disturbance, as long as the sward is showing plenty of soil, and get the seed placed in. Continue to graze. If you have sheep or even calves, you can keep them into that oversown sward for another week or so, and then get them off before the seeds start to sprout. And then if everything goes well, you should be ready for grazing 68 weeks later. And the other additional point to put in there is to watch out for any new broadleaf weeds germinating that you might have to do some post-emergent sprays. Next slide. So just to sum up, I think grass clover swards certainly can substitute a significant amount of fertilizer nitrogen and improve herbage digestibility at the same time. And in terms of what we talked about earlier, the carrying capacity, et cetera, the grass clover swards with a tactical use of 50 kilograms of nitrogen in the spring can give you the same productivity and performance as a grass-only sward with 200 kilograms of nitrogen on average. And that straight away is money saved. And finally, just, clover, I think, can help to strike that balance that we're trying to achieve, the balance between animal productivity and a reduction in overall emissions. Thank you.
David, thank you. There's a lot of content there, and a lot of you've covered a lot of ground in a short space of time. So thank you for that, and thank you to everybody for all the questions that have come in already as well. I certainly will have a tough job at the end trying to summarise it all down into the time that's available. So thank you for that, and please do keep them coming. Our third speaker is Dr. Francis Lively from AFBI. Francis will update us on what research is currently telling us about grassland management, grazing management, and also what to aim for in terms of making good quality silage in 2021. So over to you, Francis. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, David, and good evening, everyone. This evening, as David mentioned, I'm going to outline why grass is your greatest asset, and I'm going to highlight some of the benefits and why we really need to use grass as our greatest asset. So Heather, if we move on to the second slide. So firstly, in terms of why grass is our greatest asset, grass is the cheapest feedstuff available for ruminant livestock in Northern Ireland. A recent report from AFBI and CAFRE dairy team has indicated that on a dry matter basis, grazed grass it has a cost of around 79 tonnes of dry matter per tons of dry matter, relative to grass silage in which is about twofold that, and concentrates in which is about threefold that. And as grass is a highly nutritious feedstuff, it's important we get as much of this cheap feedstuff into our livestock. And doing so, we really will improve the productivity at the farm level. We'll reduce the need for concentrates as well, and that will all lead to profitability. So it's really key to maximize the amount of grazed grass in the diet of our livestock. David has already mentioned some of the environmental benefits, but if we think of grass production can sequester carbon in the soil, and that is of increasing importance to society today. In terms of grass and in terms of livestock, why are we producing livestock? We're producing livestock for meat, and grass produced from beef is a very desirable product. There's a range of research studies out there, both within and internal and external to AFBI, that has shown health benefits of grass-fed beef. It is a desirable flavour, a good flavour that is highly sought after, and it also has a favourable fatty acid ratio and high levels of vitamin D. So it is a very healthy product, and a product that is certainly desired by society. But as farmers, how do we realise the full potential of grass? So tonight I'm going to look at the role of grazed grass and also the role of conserved forages and silage. Northern Ireland has an ideal climate for grass production. We regularly monitor grass growth through Grass Check, and I'm sure you're all familiar with Grass Check that is published in the paper on a weekly basis. In terms of beef and sheep farms, it's been previously reported that the average beef and sheep farm utilise about 4.1 tonnes of dry matter per hectare, relative to dairy farms who are achieving about 7.5 tonnes of dry matter per hectare. That said, there's a number of our Grass Check beef farmers are actually achieving high levels of production and are regularly achieving over 12 tonnes of dry matter with high utilisation rates. On the graph, if we look at the yellow or orange bars, it shows the production level for 2020. And you can clearly see that production across the farms range from about just over 8 tonne right up to 13 tonne of dry matter per hectare. Equally as important as production is the ability to utilise that forage. The more forage can be utilised, the less is wasted, and the more better it is for the farm. You can see on our Grass Check farms, utilisation rate is averaging about 80%, but there's some higher than that, up to 95% utilisation rate. Production and utilisation can be influenced by a lot of factors. Your location, your soil type, can be, as earlier alluded to, the weather. These are obviously out of your control, but what is it in your control is the management. Both nutrient management and grazing management can influence how you utilise and how you can improve the utilisation of your pasture. Moving on to our next slide. Within Northern Ireland, there's 3 main grazing strategies adopted on beef farms: set stalked, rotational grazing, or paddock grazing. Set stalked, whereby cattle are turned out in the spring and by and large stay in the same area right throughout the grazing season. Rotational grazing, where the land grazing platform is divided up into maybe 4 or 5 areas, 4 or 5 paddocks, and this allows animals to be moved every 5 to 7 days throughout the grazing season, so that they're going to new pasture, possibly once new pasture every week. On the other hand, you can go a more intensive system to rotational grazing, and which is paddock grazing, and this is where cattle go into smaller cells, smaller blocks of land, and graze it out in a shorter time period. and regularly in beef systems, we would see this duration being maybe 2-3 days. However, a recent survey of beef farmers in Northern Ireland indicated that still over 50% of farmers are actually using set stocking to graze their beef cattle. So if we think of efficiency and production and utilisation, how does this stack up? This is some research undertaken a number of years ago, and it showed that moving from set stocking to rotational grazing, you could actually increase your production, your yield by over 4 tonne of dry matter per hectare. And this 4 tonne is not by increased fertilizer or increased nutrients. This is just by increased management. By grazing the land down and then letting the plant and moving the animals on in your rotational system, that allowed the plant to rest and to grow and to generate a higher yield. So very important just how you manage. And this is additional yield with no additional cost. In terms of utilisation, as they move from set stocking to rotational grazing, the increased utilisation rate increased by 56%. If you move further to paddock grazing, you could further improve utilisation by up to 92%. So really, in summary, a small investment in water troughs, electric fencer posts and wire, and a little bit of labour could give a high return on investment. Relative to other equipment that you could buy on the farm, really these small low cost equipment could really return a high return on investment. Moving on now to some more recent work done at AFBI, and this was a recent study where we moved one step further. We looked at paddocks where cattle were moved either 3 or 4 days, so on an average 3.5 day paddocks, and we compared that to daily paddocks. Within the daily paddocks, the animals were offered the exact amount of grass that they needed for that day. So we looked at the live weight of the animal and the grass availability and basically gave them a paddock that suited that system. Within this grazing system, we were able to increase the grass utilisation by 19%. The animal production per hectare increased by 33%. And actually, whenever we count that up, that was worth about £656 per hectare. So it really shows that there can be profit by improving your grazing system. Albeit there is some consideration needs to go into the labour demand. And we do know labour is a limited resource on a lot of beef farms. And it's for that reason that we are currently just started a project at Hillsborough looking at virtual fencing, and this will reduce the labour associated with allocating grass to livestock on a daily basis. Next slide, Heather, please. So now if we consider the grass and what actually influences the performance of the animals that are consuming that grass. As we previously noted, grass is a very good energy source, and this good energy source can support high levels of performance. However, performance is determined on the quality of the grass that is offered to the livestock. You can see in the photographs in the centre, it shows various grass plants. So the first one, the first photograph in the centre of the screen shows a post-grazing cover of 16 to 1800 kilograms. And this is a typical, this is the height that you'd want to graze paddocks down to. The photograph in the centre is the pre-grazing height. And at this stage, it's about 10 centimetres height. It's about 3,000 kilograms dry matter per hectare. And the plant, if you look at the little photograph above, it shows the 3 leaves. And those 3 leaves are 3 healthy green leaves that are nutritious. Once you move to a higher cover, there's a higher amount of fibre in the plant. One leaf starts to die. So not only do you have more fibre and more seed head in which is less digestible, you also have dead material that's also less digestible. And as a result, you'll have lower quality, the grass will be a lower quality feedstuff and will not sustain as high a level of performance. So overall quality is very dependent on the stage of growth, and it will vary slightly throughout the season. And the sward composition will obviously influence it as well. Moving to the next slide, Heather. So how do we maximize the potential of grass? Well, really to maximize the potential of grass, we want to aim to keep cattle at grass as long as possible. As earlier noted, grazed grass is cheaper than is the cheapest feedstuff. So the more grazed grass we can get into the animals, the cheaper we can actually produce them. Grass quality varies throughout the year, but in the spring, grass quality is very high quality, is of its highest quality. And there's a lot of scientific evidence out there that have clearly demonstrated turning cattle out early in the spring results in higher performance. One example of this is work undertaken at Hillsborough, where steers were turned out 17 days earlier than their counterparts. Their counterparts were kept in the house on a silage diet. That autumn, the animals that were turned out earlier were 23 kilograms heavier. The following spring, when they were then housed and finished, they were still 8 kilograms heavier. And this actually worked through to the animals being actually worth more and had a higher carcass value. And the carcass value of just 18 pounds per head, and that's not to be laughed at in beef production when margins can be limited. Not only would the carcass be worth more, but you've also got to consider the lower production costs and the lower environmental footprint. The lower production costs, the more grazed grass, so obviously the lower concentrate and lower silage requirement. The less time they're in the house meant lower slurry production, and being out of grass longer meant there was less ammonia emissions from the livestock. Then if we look at autumn and an autumn grass, and really this is a recent study, we've looked at weanlands, so suckler weanlands that were either housed at the end of October and offered grass silage and concentrates, or their counterparts were put back out after weaning, were put back out to grass and grazed in a rotational grazing system. As you can see, in this particular year, it was a dry season and we were able to keep cattle out, the calves out for quite a long period of time. But really in terms of performance, there was very limited difference in performance and weight in these animals. And certainly once it come to the following turnout, there was no difference in live weight. But what was substantially different was the feed cost. The feed cost of the animals that were kept at grass was lower, and it worked out about approximately 62 pence per head per day. So even, I know in this particular study, it was quite unique that we were able to get them out for 86 days, but even if that was only 2 weeks, it would work until about £9 per head per day. And that would be equivalent to 2 or 3 pence per kilogram carcass weight. So again, it's money worth having. So overall, the other point worth noting here is autumn grass can be high quality. And indeed, where there's the availability of autumn grass, light cattle such as weanlands can utilize this very well. And the grass quality that they're consuming can be of higher quality feedstuff as many grass silages that are produced in Northern Ireland. So really, provided grass is available, ground conditions permit, extended the grazing season into the autumn will reduce your silage requirement, it will reduce slurry production, it'll reduce, and collectively this will reduce your production costs, and obviously there's environmental benefits there as well from this. I'm now going to move over and look at once the cattle are housed and look at what determines silage quality. Silage quality is largely determined by the digestibility value of that. And like the grass plant earlier that we were chatting about, as the grass plant matures and it gets more reproductive, there's more of a seed head, the digestibility value declines. So as the seed head as the plant gets closer to maturity, you have more seed head, you have more fiber. The quantity, the plant will always have three live leaves, and as it grows older, so after a 3-4 week period, you'll start getting dead material, and both the extra fiber and the increase in this dead material will mean there is the digestibility will decline. A study at Hillsborough clearly showing this. We're cutting in late May relative to early June or mid-June. You could see the decline, roughly, a decline in D value as you delayed the cutting date, the harvesting date. Once the silage was offered to animals, the intake, silage was offered ad libitum to the animals, and the animals were able to eat as much as they wanted. And in this study, you can clearly see the lower quality silage had the lower intakes, and having lower intakes also meant lower live weight gain. So why do we always talk about producing high quality silage? It is important. The higher the quality of the silage, the higher the animal intake, and the higher the performance from those animals. So how do we go about making higher quality silage? And very often we hear about more bulk, and if you go with more bulk, you end up with less quality. So very often in beef production systems, farmers opt for a 2-cut system of heavier bulk relative to a 3-cut system. Some research undertaken at AFBI a number of years ago looked at a 2-cut system where silage was cut in late in sort of early to mid-June, and then 8 to 10 weeks later, another large harvest was taken off the same land. The silage combined had an average D value of about 63. We then compared that to a 3-cut system where the grass was cut earlier, towards the end of May, again 6 to 8 weeks later in July, and again in August. Collectively, the average yield of grass from the 2 systems was lower on the 3-cut system, but the quality was higher. In terms of the cost of the grass on the 2-cut system was lower than that on the 3-cut system. So per ton of product, per ton of silage, the 2-cut system grass was about 12% cheaper to make than the 3-cut system. But actually, whenever you converted this cost down to megajoules of energy, the actual 3-cut system it wasn't cheaper, still slightly more expensive, but was only 4% more expensive than the 2-cut system. So the differential had disappeared. So what is this silage then? What happens then once you feed this silage to the animals? And really, in this study, this produced silage was offered to finishing cattle, and they either got 2.5 kilos of meal or 5 kilos of meal for the 2-cut system, and the cattle on the 3-cut system got 2.5 kilos of meal. As seen in the previous study, the lower quality silage had a lower silage. The animals offered the lower quality silage had a lower dry matter intake relative to the 3-cut system, the higher quality silage. And again, the carcass gain was lower. So 0.5 relative to 0.76 for the higher quality silage. So if we look there, and I suppose the important figure from this table is the feed cost minus carcass value on a daily basis. The 2-cut system on 2.5 kilos of meal, the difference there was about 54 pence per day, whereas in the high quality silage, it is £1.14 per day. So really, what does this mean? It really means that, we want to aim for making high quality grass silage. If we make high quality grass silage, the cattle will consume more of it. We'll have a lower yield of it. So that means we need to put more land in and cut more silage. But with higher quality silage, you'll have higher animal intakes. You'll require higher volumes of silage. But overall, you can get away with feeding a lot less concentrates on the farm. And as a consequence, you'll have more profit for the farmer at the end of the day. And we mention and often hear about the bulk scenario, but actually if you improve your grassland management within your grazing system, you can actually free up land and that will leave more land available for silage production. And overall, this will actually reduce your concentrate input. And that has both economical benefits, but it's also environmental benefits where you're taking less concentrates onto the farm, you're taking less phosphorus onto the farm. The higher quality silage is resulting in higher performance of the animals, and as a result, they'll meet their endpoint, they'll meet their target slaughter weight a lot younger, and that'll reduce the days on the farm. And as a consequence, it'll be better from the environment as well. So just in summary, grass production and utilisation at a farm level can be variable. Paddock grazing can greatly improve production and utilisation rates at the farm gate. Grass is a highly nutritious feedstuff, so don't underestimate that, and it can support high levels of performance, but this is dependent if it's consumed or harvested at the correct stage. Offering high quality forage will reduce concentrate requirement. And really the take-home message from this presentation tonight, grass is a major driver of productivity. environmental sustainability and profitability at the farm level. Thank you.
Okay, Francis, thank you. And again, thank you for getting through a lot of information in a short amount of time. And I'll come back to you on the questions at the end. So look, move on to our final speakers, and together, Kieran Hamill, who's the Senior Beef and Sheep Advisor with CAFRE, and together with James Henderson, Beef and Sheep Farmer in Kilkeel, are going to again look at this whole issue of grass, your greatest asset, and bring together a lot of the issues and explain how maybe a lot of these issues actually work in practice on a working farm. So over to Kieran and to James. Thank you.
David, thank you, and thanks very much to the organising committee for inviting myself and James here to talk about it. I'm just going to give a very brief introduction and let James tell you how he's implementing a lot of the practical elements of the research that Suzanne and David and Francis have told you about there. So I work for CAFRE. I'm a Senior Beef and Sheep Advisor based in Armagh, and we cover the southern region of Northern Ireland and work with approximately 500 beef and sheep farmers and business development groups. And I suppose that in terms of knowledge and technology transfer, we are the bridge between research and the theory that Suzanne and David and Francis have talked about, and the practical implementation of that on farm. And at the minute, we're doing that through business development groups and getting groups of farmers together to share the good practice or the best practice, and trying to get those farmers to learn from each other and drive some positive change. And James is going to tell you just a little bit about what he has done, working with the advisors that he works with in the beef group and the sheep group that he works with, and particularly Michael Doherty over a long number of years to develop that. So what are we actually looking at? We're looking at the theme of sustainable beef production and sustainability. There's lots written about sustainability, but most of it centers on three pillars: the environmental, societal, and economic sustainability. And there's an element of that is around viability as well. So we're trying to make viable, sustainable businesses, and that's important. So what are we trying to do, looking particularly at James's farm and some of what we're doing? And essentially, in relation to James, we're looking at a defined system, and as advisors, and looking at technology transfer and trying to get farmers to take up technology. One of the most important things is actually have a defined system. What are you trying to do? And James is going to outline what he's doing in that calf to beef system. And if we look then at the elements of a calf to beef system, animal health is essential, as with any livestock enterprise. But there's bits to that, so having a health plan, looking at housing, ventilation and housing, and how they're fed, the space requirements, that's all important. Looking at rotating grazing blocks. So James is a sheep enterprise, a beef enterprise, and silage, and rotating those so that sheep are grazing where silage was made last year, and cattle are grazing where sheep were grazed last year, if that's possible. And then being careful about nutrition in all the senses, looking at the mineral supplementation that's required, taking blood samples if required. So a lot of elements to animal health. Looking at soil health, Suzanne has been through all of that very comprehensively, looking at the soil analysis and having a proper nutrient management plan. Don't be wasteful. If you're looking at driving efficiency and driving productivity on a farm, you have to have a nutrient management plan. And both David and Suzanne have talked about the timing of nutrient application being important. We do a lot of work on benchmarking and trying to promote benchmarking to farmers, and one of the things that shows is how stocking rate is a key driver of margins and profitability. And how do you get a better stocking rate? So you're looking at grass growth and utilisation. David and Francis have been through the research on that, looking at the sward composition and the potential on each farm and putting in place a good grazing system. And there's a lot of technology around that as advisors we are trying to encourage farmers to use, and through the development groups other farmers are showing people how that's done. And elements of that, whether it's electronic or electric fencing, either permanent or temporary, or just better fencing. Looking at some of how the environmental farming schemes have reported putting some fencing on farms out there, and water and access to paddocks. And again, it has been mentioned before, being flexible. Can you put larger numbers? Can you take paddocks out for grazing, whatever? So those are just elements of that. Francis has done a comprehensive review of silage there. I'm trying to make sure that you get the timing right for fertilizer application, timing of cutting to maximize quality, whether you need to wilt again to do that. And all of that is summarized by just paying really good attention to detail. And one of the things that we're trying to do, and James will be able to tell you a little bit more about that, is to look at measuring to manage. James is going to tell you about measuring grass growth, doing silage analysis, doing soil analysis, looking at the animal weights, doing financial benchmarking, and see what the impact of that is. But the important thing is that if you're doing that, what are the targets? So it's okay to do all that measurement, but you need to do the comparisons, and comparisons get your targets, and what are the targets and what action do you take. And the most important part of that is that you need to take some action around that. What does success look like on your farm? How do you know if you're doing it well? So just a couple of slides from James's farm. Whenever I go through the benchmarking, looking at the timeline, and people say sustainability. Sustainability isn't an end. Sustainability is a process or a journey, and the development of any farm is a journey. So just looking at the journey James has been on from our perspective, from the benchmarking perspective, James has increased stocking rate, and that has driven a significant increase in the gross margin per hectare. Again, gross margin will allow you to spend some money on other farm inputs, so you'll have money to spend on the fixed costs, and you'll have also money to provide income for the farm family. So that gross margin is a clear indicator of technical competence and technical efficiency, and it's about driving efficient production. It's not necessarily about increasing production. It's about being more efficient in that production. I'm looking specifically at the calf to beef enterprise that James has, looking at sort of over the last 5 to 6 years on benchmarking. You'll see there a very significant decrease, the red line, significant decrease in concentrate usage. Through driving stocking rate, they've been able to increase animal numbers without increasing the amount of fertilizer in total used on the farm. That's making the farm more efficient and certainly more sustainable. And again, driving that within that enterprise, a significant increase in the gross margin. And you'll see then over the last couple of years that gross margin leveling out at that high level, and looking now at reducing inputs to try and drive that in the future. So I'll hand over to James and let him tell you about what he does on the farm in practical terms.
Good evening, everyone. It's good to speak to you. Thank you, Kieran. There's just a very brief profile of the farm. And as has already been said, we have beef and sheep, just over 300 sheep lambing down each spring, 250 ewes, and then 60 odd ewe lambs. And then the thrust of what we're looking at tonight is then the dairy calf to beef enterprise, and how we are maximizing and utilizing the grass that we grow. Kieran has already spoken a little bit there on the benchmarking on the right hand side, so I'll not touch on that, but we're aiming to produce our beef as efficiently as we can and utilise the grass that we grow in order to do so. And if you could maybe move on to the next slide, Kieran, thank you. We buy in calves in the autumn time, October, November usually. We're dairy origin heifers, many Belgian Blue and Limousins, some Hereford and Angus thrown in there as well. But the majority are the Blue and Limousin. That first winter is the most expensive period on the farm. They're consuming somewhere in the region of 30 kilograms of milk powder and in around 300 kilograms of meal. Kieran also touched on the quantity of meal. That would be somewhere in around 60% of the total meal that is consumed on their lifetime on farm. But we're aiming to have those young calves away somewhere in the region of 22 to 24 months at in around 320 to 340 kilograms of carcass. Being the most expensive period, we have tried to reduce the cost of that this year, and then Kieran will show you the next slide. One of the things we've introduced is a red clover sward, and that's high protein forage. Our home mix from 12 weeks on contains somewhere in the region of 200 kilograms of soya. So I'm hoping that high quality protein will help me to reduce the inputs there of the soya. And we baled our red clover there last week in ideal conditions, and it has received 3,000 gallons of cattle slurry to the acre on a dribble bar there the next day. So hopefully another cut of clover will be taken late June just on that slurry alone. And one of the most important parts then for me in the whole grassland management and is measuring of grass on a weekly basis. Francis had highlighted grass check, and most of you I'm sure are familiar with the bulletin, and I'm one of those who's out every week measuring grass. We measure our paddocks pre and post grazing, but we're also taking a weekly measurement. It takes me 6 or 7 miles to walk around the paddocks on a Saturday morning or afternoon. It's not just good exercise for me, but it's a very important exercise from the point of view that I know exactly how much grass I have on farm going into the next week. And with the up and down season that we have at times, grass growth can be very erratic. 2 weeks ago, we were doing 40 kilograms of dry matter per day. Last Saturday, we were over 80. So we have to try and match that up with the demand of our stock. And maybe then, Kieran, could you move to the next slide, please? We take those figures and we put them onto the AgriNet account. It takes me about 15 minutes on an evening on once a week to do that. And hopefully your screen is big enough there to see each of those columns represents a paddock and the grass cover that's on those paddocks. And that blue line is the demand. That's how much grass I require. Stock numbers have been entered and their weights have been put in, and I update those weights every 2 weeks. But that's quite a nice grass wedge. It's sitting well. Not all of them sit as well as that. Sometimes there's gaps below that line and there's a deficit. Other times we have a surplus of grass. And as I look at that on a weekly basis, I can see planning ahead. If I have a surplus, I can take out bales. If there's a bit of a deficit, I can then take out, or I can take some of those surplus bales and feed to slow down the rotation so that I have ample grass ahead of the stock on a weekly basis. Another thing that I get from that measuring, and this is something at the end of the year we look at, is the grass growth and production of each paddock. You see there over towards the left-hand side, there's paddock doing over 15 tonne of dry matter per hectare. Over in the middle, there's others doing maybe 9 or less. And there's quite a difference, 6-7 tonne of a difference there. Those paddocks in the middle have already been taken out and have been reseeded. So that gives me a clear indication, provided, of course, as Suzanne was speaking earlier, that P and K are at the right level and our pH is right, that particular paddock is under producing, so therefore I'm reseeding that. So it's not something I do just at random, but I've taken those figures and I've used them in order to make my reseeding decisions. If we could move on then, Kieran, thank you. Calves are reared with the view of going to grass and no meal. The calves this year went through the winter and a maximum of 2 kilograms of meal per day, and they were doing 0.89 of a kilo. They went to grass there in early April. The older cattle were out in the end of March, but are on 2-day paddock system, and we're looking to graze them throughout the season on grass alone. The only other thing they'll get is supplemented with minerals, and that's usually in a tablet form in the water. But if we could move on then to the next slide, please, Kieran. We aim to get those calves doing at least 0.9 of a kilo, or maybe upwards on a kilo a day of live weight gain. Francis has already touched on grazing covers, and that's ideally what we want to be putting them in around that 10 centimeters and get it grazed out really well in the springtime to what we have there in that middle caption, down to about 4 centimeters. In the springtime, we would be placing our greatest emphasis or leaning towards utilisation and getting the grass grazed down, good quality grass. We make sure that it's grazed down tight, and that then that leaves a good leafy sward throughout the rest of the season for to be utilised, and good quality grass throughout the whole season. On the left-hand side there, you'll see something as well that we've been implementing now off and on, but I'm using it on a regular basis, and that is pre-mowing of paddocks on every other location or every other rotation, sorry. And hopefully the next slide will maybe explain to you why. As we progress into the season, there's a lot more contaminated grass on the sward, and it's frustrating whenever you have grown that grass and it's nice and leafy, and some nice clover there you'll see. Hopefully that'll please David Patterson. But in the foreground, you see grass has been grazed out well, it's grazed out tight, and yet there's quite a lot of refused grass which those young calves aren't eating. Now, maybe those of you who are suckler farmers who are listening in, you can get your suckler cows to clean that up. But those dairy origin calves which are just dependent on grass, it's more difficult to do so, and performance will be hit if you're forcing them to eat too much of that contaminated grass. So I was frustrated at that paddock on the left, and the calves had only been in it a day and a half, and they were unhappy and wanted to get out. What we did was we went home and we brought the mower, and the very next paddock we mowed off the grass in front of them, and that's it there on the right hand side. We split the paddock in two, and we give them a half that day and the other half the next day. And hopefully you'll see there's an awful lot better clean out, and the grass is much better utilised. And there were very good intakes from that as well. Just on that subject, maybe you're saying, well, you know, you're forcing them to eat grass which they wouldn't normally have ate, they would have refused. Yes, that may be so, but they're also eating a higher dry matter, and their dry matter intakes are better. And we actually found over last summer that those young calves were on that mix of pre-grazing, or sorry, pre-mowing on every other rotation, that they had done 0.99 of a kilo, and we were finding grass was much better utilised. The paddock on the left-hand side, which they hadn't cleaned out, they were in it a day and a half. The paddock on the right-hand side, we got 2 days grazing out of it. So if you take a 6-day period, how do we continue to do what we were doing? We would have gone through 4 paddocks. Instead of that, we pre-mowed the next paddocks, and we went through 3 paddocks. So we had at the end of those 6 days, we had an extra paddock to graze. Moving on then to the autumn time, and that picture on the right hand side there was taken last October, and Francis had already touched on the quality of autumn grass. Sometimes maybe people don't think it's of as good a nutritional value as what you think, but I would like to think that if the paddocks are managed properly throughout the grazing season, you still have good quality leafy swards right to the base of the plant. That group there in September and October last year did 0.97 of a kilo on that autumn grass. The previous year, we had a batch of calves that did, from the end of August right through to they were housed in mid-November, they did 1.07 kilos per day on supposed second class autumn grass. So there is still good value in autumn grass if it's managed right throughout the spring. We probably won't graze it just as tight in the autumn time as we do in the spring. The sheep will maybe come in and tidy up any grass that's left. We'll graze it down probably to 4.5 or 5 centimeters. In the springtime, we lean towards utilization. In the middle of the summer, we're trying to balance the utilization and the performance together. In the autumn time, we'll lean slightly more towards performance. And because we have the sheep, they'll clean out that paddocks for the next grazing season. After their first year at grass, then those young calves are housed. Hopefully they'll live somewhere in the region of 200 kilos just at grass alone. And then if we could move on to the next slide, please. Kieran, this is then the other side of the important grassland management, is trying to make that good quality silage. Calves will go in, and our aim in the system is to take them over the winter as a store period, hopefully somewhere in around 0.7 of a kilo per day. And to do that, we need to be making good quality silage, hopefully in around 30% dry matter, 70 plus D value, and maybe in around 12 of an AME, and hopefully somewhere around 14 protein. Don't always hit all of those targets. We're out just to make good quality silage that will see animals stored over the winter. If it means we feed half a kilo of meal, so be it. But we've gone away from a 2-cut system to making better quality silage, and that has then reduced our concentrate usage over the winter. Some store cattle on average silage would have needed perhaps 2 kilos of meal per head per day, where we have taken that down. Last winter, they got half a kilo up until Christmas time, and then they moved on to the first cut silage and received no concentrate whatsoever, just 100 grams of minerals per day. And over the winter, they performed at 0.64 of a kilo. Then compensatory growth will hopefully kick in the early spring of the next year, in their second year at grass, and we'll take them on through to that autumn. Some of the Angus and Hereford will finish in the later part of the summer, and Kieran has put up there the final slide, and that's the end product, hopefully. That particular batch of cattle, that was taken in early October, just the day before they were slaughtered, and those animals received no meal at grass. They went off grass and went straight to slaughter. Some will receive a small supplementation at grass. Others will be housed maybe for a 30-day period or maximum, but we're aiming to finish, or to put that finish on them where possible at grass. And to do that, we have to be trying to keep on top of our grazing and provide them with good quality swards throughout the season. And that batch, just checked up today, there were 3, as far as fat class was concerned, there were 3 of them were 3-, and everything else was over and above that. So that was the condition of those animals, just going straight off grass. And hopefully that maybe gives you a very brief summary of what we're doing here on farm. Our system has been set up to produce beef from as much grazed grass as possible. And as Kieran showed, we have reduced our concentrate usage from somewhere up in the region of 1,200-1,300 kilograms in the lifetime of the animal on farm, down to under 5, and we're hoping to settle somewhere there between 400 and 500 kilograms of concentrate in the lifetime of the animal on farm. David, I think that maybe is a brief summary of what we're doing here on the home farm.
Okay, I think hopefully I'm here now. Sorry, yes, I was having technical issues there, James. I suppose one thing for you, James, just to point out, you said there that suckler cows would clean out your swords. I'm not too sure about that. I think my suckler cows are not very good at cleaning out swords later on in the season. They get very unhappy and very they're difficult to manage later on in the season when the grass gets dirty. So I'm not so sure. Wouldn't be advising you to start into sucklers to clean out your swords. Look, we've got loads of questions, and we're not going to get through them all, being realistic, and we're going to have to deal with some of these issues beyond the meeting with maybe we'll put some sort of document trying to cover a lot of the stuff. But and I suppose that an important thing for us all maybe to note, in CAFRE, AFBI, and even ourselves in the Farmers Journal, is that a lot of questions about soil health, and about clover, and I think those are areas that maybe we all need to take cognizance of, that those are areas where there's a lot of hunger for knowledge and a lot of gaps in knowledge, maybe potentially as well. So that's something we all should note. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take Suzanne first. I'm going to fire a few questions at Suzanne, and I'll move to David and Francis, Kieran, and James. So we'll do it that way if that's okay. So Suzanne, I'm going to come to you first. And if you can, just keep if you can do one-word answers, great. But if you can keep them brief, if you can. Lime, pH of 6, Suzanne. Do we still keep on liming at pH 6, or do we let it drop below 6? And also maybe comment on some farmers asking there about, some guys would say maybe 6.5 should be the target, not 6. Just a couple of comments around that, Suzanne, please.
Okay, so in the UK, the recommendation is 6 to 6.2, so that'll be optimum for perennial ryegrass, and that's the kind of UK recommendation. So if you're at 6 already, you're talking about just maintaining that. So you don't really, if you're putting on a maintenance dressing, it would just be a very little amount of lime, so it mightn't be worth your while. You better let it drop under 6, and then if you're getting a contractor in, it'd be worth your money and putting on the lime. Now you can maintain it topping up with lime, and if you can buy like pelletized lime then and do it yourself with a fertilizer spreader. So it's what your budget is, if you can afford to do that. But it would be basically, if you're already at 6, it'd be a maintenance dressing. I know in the south they tend to push it up maybe towards 6.5. The danger of going too high on your pH is you can lock up some trace elements. So that's the reason you don't want to be pushing your pH too high.
A couple of questions here about sulfur, Suzanne. How do I know I need sulfur? I take it it's a blanket advice to say we need sulfur. I think with the way emissions used to be in the good old days of coal-fired power stations, there was sulfur in the air, and there isn't that anymore. How do I know I need it? And is there any other source of it apart from fertilizer? And also 2010-10, them sort of products don't tend to come with sulfur, so a couple of questions around sulfur.
Okay, so sulfur deficiency is very hard to detect. So it might appear like nitrogen deficiency, so there might be a bit of yellowing in the grass, but you can't be sure if that's nitrogen deficiency or sulfur deficiency. So we would say get your grass tested. So at our Hillsborough lab, we would actually test the grass, and our New Forge lab, they can show you if you're deficient in sulfur. Now, generally, we would suggest that everybody should put on sulfur in that first application in spring, and that'll just keep you right. In terms of a sulfur containing fertilizer, so to get that sulfur on early, you could actually put on slurry and get your P and K from your slurry, and then put on a nitrogen sulfur fertilizer, so top up with nitrogen with sulfur in it. And then if you wanted to put on a P and K fertilizer later on, you could. So if you get your P and K from slurry first and get your sulfur on the spring with a nitrogen sulfur fertilizer, and then sources of sulfur. So I know that some things like mushroom compost, I've heard it contains sulfur. There's other soil conditioners. You can get different products out there. Maybe novel products contain sulfur. Now, we haven't really done a lot of work on those in AFBI and testing how good they are and things. So I just know that mushroom compost is something, but we don't have any scientific evidence of how good some of those things are at the moment. So we would just stick to a nitrogen sulfur fertilizer. But maybe we'll do some work on that later on.
And just on the lime, actually, an article in the paper this week just about a guy who's now started eggshells as another source of lime potentially, or of calcium. So there is other sources of lime out there as well, potentially maybe coming forward. A quick simple one, maybe Suzanne, fertilizer for settage once or twice. I suppose it depends on what you're putting on in one dump. But if you're putting on 3 bags to the acre, maybe you should go twice. Yes or no?
Yes, because if you put on a whole load at once and then you get rain, you're likely to lose a lot more of it. But if you're putting on a couple of times, you're less maybe chance of hitting bad weather and losing it. And you're then drip feeding the nitrogen. So there's always nitrogen there for growth. Okay.
And then one for you, in a 3-cut system, if I'm putting on 2,000 gallons per acre of slurry before each cut, do I need to apply on a field with a P index of 2+? Do I need to apply any phosphorus? I suppose the answer to that one is probably not at all. And you shouldn't be looking at if you go onto the carbon or go onto the nutrient calculator on AFBI online, you'll plug in your figures and you'll maybe see what you need there. But
yes,
probably not.
So yeah, if you're at a 2+, you generally should be okay without any additional phosphorus. You'd only, if you're pushing 3 cuts and putting on a lot of nitrogen, you might need some. But if you're a lower nitrogen person, if you're at a 2+, you don't need any more phosphorus. Only if you're at the lower end of index 2, you could put some on. You wouldn't. Yeah, you would need some.
Yeah. Okay. Right. David, I'm going to move to you next. I have lots of questions for you, but we'll have to. Hopefully, we'll get through what we can here. A number of questions around Clover safe sprays, David. And I think there's some experience we would have had in the programs over the years is if you're doing a reseed and you put in Clover, the Clover safe spray actually worked very well in a new reseed. It took out a lot of them competing weeds at seeding stage. But issues around being able to availability of Clover safe spray, I suppose, is maybe is what people are asking about this evening.
Yeah. Well, first of all, yeah, those sprays do exist. There's not anywhere near as many of Clover safe products choices to pick from, and who knows, maybe this year with all of the other market supply issues going on, they could be even harder to get. But they do exist. I'm not going to go into any product names, but they're there, and contact your local expert, even your local merchant would be a good place to start with and take their advice. In terms of dealing with broadleaf weeds and grass clover, much better to try and deal with it before. If you had an ongoing dock problem or a high dock burden, you get that sorted out first before you introduce the clover.
In terms of something I've often wondered about and said to me quite a bit is a lot of guys struggle to grow clover on the land type that they have, and a few questions there around LFA, SDA land, colder areas. Maybe does clover work in those land types? And also a question around what, maybe broader than that, even what grass varieties are best suited to those sort of to that land type.
Well, yeah, there have been AFBI studies over the years. Jim McAdam did work in upland areas with clover, never mind SDA. So it's the heavier, if you like, later and higher type situations that you're dealing with sometimes will be more challenging for clover. I can't pretend otherwise. But equally, those are also more challenging conditions for grass species. Which kind of brings me to the second answer. And take the worst situation, a slightly high altitude farm on a north-facing slope on heavy soil. There's probably your worst cocktail of things. Grass and clover will do well there. Ryegrass less so maybe than timothy. So you could introduce. I'm a great believer in sort of these bespoke solutions for particular fields and different conditions. But timothy would have a lower growth threshold in the spring, which is particularly important, and is actually quite compatible with clover as well. So with clever choices, you can deal with those what might on the face of it seem like a very harsh set of conditions?
In terms of stitching in clover into no sward, a 20-row sward, is there any point doing that even? And I suppose the second question is around a few questions there around would an aerator help, you know, if you to establish the clover, and also guttlers and that sort of stuff, you know, what's the best thing for that?
I suppose it's about maybe working with your CAFRE advisor, for example, and take a really good look at the field in question. If you're doing your measurement or any form of assessment, you've identified the problem field. You look at the sward, how much of that is still, in rough percentages, how much of that is still what you might call sown grasses, like perennial ryegrass and timothy and so on, and how much, if there is any clover at all, and what weed burden there is. In terms of the soil and the aeration point, if there is a compaction or a surface drainage, or if you ever see some surface ponding after heavy rain like we had all day, that's a really good day to indicate which fields might need some aeration. So slicing into that top surface before you do the oversowing would be really, really good, but it won't make any benefit or difference to the clover establishment. You might argue that some of those clover seeds dropping down into those knife holes is lost forever. So aerator, good for solving a problem, but not any benefit at all for the actual clover establishment.
David, there's a number of questions there for you, and I wouldn't mind, it would be useful if you did take a look at the questions afterwards and maybe try and put a Q&A together. I think there's a lot of stuff for you and Suzanne there. So
despite that joke earlier, David, yes, I will do that for you.
Yeah. Well, we're still all right, David. We're all right. I'll move on to Francis, just briefly, Francis. Francis, the first thing you need to explain is, in 2 lines, is what a virtual fence is.
A virtual fence, especially a collar that's fitted on the animal, and you can then from your phone determine where the animal moves, really. So essentially you can paddock graze without any wire. There's a collar on the animal, and it will determine where the animal grazes. New technology, and we've just recently procured it and just getting ready to start trials on that there. More around the welfare side, but on the behavioural side, but in due course, they are certainly there's some examples in throughout the world where these are working very, very successfully to graze cattle.
Just there is an animal welfare issue potentially around virtual fencing, but yes, in theory it's great.
In theory it's great, and a lot of behavioural work done and going to be done at the with us on that.
Do you regard crop silage as high quality silage?
No, I don't regard it as high quality silage. Crop silage, with your cereal in there, you're putting a fiber source in there, in which is reducing the energy content. So no, I don't regard crop silage. Crop silage included as part of a reseed or something like that. Yes, it might be okay as something for dry cows. Not the best feed. I would prefer grass silage.
Just a question around high quality silage for suckler cows. Obviously, if you're going to make high quality silage, you shouldn't. Well, ideally, you make high quality silage, but if you make high quality silage, you're going to have to restrict your suckler cows, particularly dry suckler cows. No question.
No question. Yeah. You'll have to restrict the dry suckler cows, so it'll depend on your situation. Obviously, even if you're going for a 3-cut system, your second cut, there's very often with weather in one scenario or another, there'll be one of the cuts mightn't just be as high a quality. Certainly, the second cut, if you go for an early cut, normally the second cut you end up with slightly more fiber in that there. It'll be more suitable to your suckler cows, and you could keep your first and third cut for your growing and finishing cattle.
And final question: wilding of 3-leaf silage, so essentially a young sward.
Yeah.
You need to be careful. The quick rabbit will good, but that sward is that sort of grass is prone to damage if you leave it too long in a wilting scenario. Francis, I assume I used to do work on wilting, so I know a bit about it, but I'm not telling you, but that's my opinion. If you give yours.
Yeah, exactly. Wilton, obviously, if you can wilt the silage, you'll improve the dry matter of it, and dry matter is a major determinant of quality. But yeah, you know, a 24-hour wilt is more than enough. Depends very much on the you know the cutting conditions. If you're cutting in the likes of, well, obviously not today, but certainly the past couple of days, where you know high sun content, high amount of wind, you know, you might need a 24-hour wilt. Once you go beyond a 24-hour wilt, you know, I don't think you need any more than that there. Silage dry matter, you don't need silage to be any more than 35, you know, 35% dry matter. You know, that's optimal. Going beyond that you can run into other problems in terms of fermentation and feeding out issues.
Okay, Francis, thank you. And finally, James and Kieran. James, your yield of your red clover first cut last week, your yield, and how long did you wilt for, and is it difficult to dry it?
Well, David, we had about 5 to 6 bales to the acre. It was wilted for 48 hours. Now, I suppose what Francis was just saying there about ideally 24 hours would have been better, but we can't tear it out because you're going to lose the leaves and you're going to lose value. So that was why we wilted it that little bit longer. But no, I was very pleased with we did get that dry period, and I was also pleased with the yield. And now hopefully we'll get a similar yield just from the slurry that was applied and no nitrogen fertilizer in a second cut.
Yeah. A couple of questions around your minerals. How you feeding the supplement, James, and maybe what are you feeding?
Yeah, well, during their time at grass, they've been fed the minerals in the water in a tablet form. Again, I'll maybe not mention the brand, but we're cobalt, selenium, iodine, and copper. And it's just for maintenance. And it does keep that right, because down in this part of the world, we're quite low in selenium. But the only drawback is with that, if we get a number of days like today, there's very little water drank by the cattle, and all they're eating is wet grass. So we have to have a fairly concentrated level there. But normally over the grazing season, it's just for maintenance. During the winter, we're feeding about 100 grams per day in the trough, either over the silage or in the meal trough, just once a day. They're given those minerals that way.
And just a quick one, James. Primo and all do you primo in all weathers? And you're working a 2-day paddock. Do you primo the whole paddock, or do you only primo half of it?
Yeah, we primo just. I suppose ideally you would primo one day what you're going to use tomorrow, but just for the simplicity of it, we mow the whole paddock off, divide it in two. We give them the first half today and the other half the next day, and we wouldn't really want to be pre-mowing too much in weathers like today, but I know last year from one experience we had a very wet day, but we pre-mowed the day before and then let them in. If the grass is going to be wet, whether it's standing or lying, on those odd occasions, but we do on all weathers, yeah.
And just 2 questions left for you, James. What live weight are you taking your heifers to? What's your target live weight at slaughter?
The target live weight for some of those like Limousin and Belgian Blues is somewhere in the region of about 620 kilos. And as far as their daily live weight concerned, over that second grazing season, it's just over a kilo a head per day. Hopefully, it's a case of them gradually laying down flesh, and those particular breeds do seem to mature pretty nicely in around that 2-year-old, where the Angus and Hereford that we have, they're very easily finished and away that wee bit earlier in the summer. That helps cash flow. It helps to take a wee bit of pressure off the grass situation as well.
And the final question is, has AFBI and CAFRE, or AFBI or CAFRE, done a carbon footprint on your farm? And if so, well, I suppose unless you'd done it last year, it's very hard to monitor what impact just concentrate uses had. But maybe Kieran could comment around that, Kieran, in terms of the carbon footprint on James's farm and the concentrate reduction that James has implemented over the last few years.
Yeah, I mean, the carbon footprint has been done, but we didn't show the results because if you're doing benchmarking, the most important comparison is how you're doing this year compared to what you did last year. And this is the first year that carbon footprint has been done. And there's probably not enough done across Northern Ireland using that system to give a valid comparison if you're looking at comparing yourself with other people. So yes, it's done, but not to, there isn't the valid comparisons to actually to make it worth putting up and trying to have a discussion over it, David. Obviously in next year we'll be able to look at that, and there is data there that we could run that for previous years to try and just get a picture for how that concentrate has affected it. But it stands to reason that if you're keeping your inputs the same, increasing your output, or keeping most of your inputs the same, reducing one of your inputs and increasing your output, your carbon footprint should be lower.
Okay.
Just David, maybe if I come in there, just to add on that there, obviously, because given if we looked at the carbon footprint on James's farm, it is quite low relative to some that we have saw, albeit we haven't a huge number. In terms of the reason, some of the reasons why it is low is particularly in and around the concentrate feed. There's very little feed being purchased onto the farm, and maximum use of grass. I suppose that's one of the key things there. Where it is slightly higher, or where there's room for potential, is enteric fermentation, in what is leading to overall methane emissions from the livestock. And obviously, through James's good management, he is reducing the slaughter rates, and certainly both on the beef and the sheep enterprise, we can see actually reductions in the slaughter rates, and that will be a key thing going forward. We're trying to push that performance to reduce the time the animals are on the farm.
Okay.
Yeah, I think David, is probably worth mentioning that, because James didn't mention it. Whenever he was starting that program, I think, James, your average slaughter age or slaughter date for lambs was October, and it's now August. And as well, if you look at the average slaughter age for cattle here, and those dairy bred cattle is probably 28 months, and James is getting his away at an average of 23, 24 months. And it's very easy to put both the carbon figures and the financial figures to show how that's improving efficiency, and the key is efficiency of production there. Yes,
and that's correct. And I suppose just in summing up, that's maybe the point I want to make, is that, as we go forward, we've got to make the best use of inputs on our farms, and where we put on fertilizer that's not needed, where we make poor quality silage, where we carry passengers in our herds, it's wasteful, both economically and environmentally, and just cannot be justified into the future. We see all these issues coming up the industry going forward around climate change, around environmental stuff, around free trade deals, around there's so many things that are going to be challenges going forward, but certainly things we can influence and change are making sure that we are making best use of our inputs in our farms. That's really what we're going to have to focus on going forward. The term productivity maybe wasn't really mentioned tonight, and I think we need to be careful about what it actually means. It's not about producing more. It's different things for different people. On James's farm, being more productive will be holding his production and using less inputs. For some farms, being more productive will be having a higher output from the current inputs. On other farms, it'll be being more productive will be having less output from even lower inputs. So productivity is a term we're going to have to all get our head around, and it's going to be a key of how we measure success into the future on our farms. And hopefully that's the message that we got across tonight, is about the importance of efficiency and productivity going forward, because those are the things that we could control in our farms. So look, thank you to everybody again for all the presenters. Thank you to everybody who asked some great questions. I said we will make sure that we get a list of the questions and answers out to everybody who was on tonight. And I think that's only fair to everybody. I didn't get around to all the questions by any means, and we had a lot of really good, and it take a lot of comfort from the level of questions and the thirst for knowledge that's out there. I think it's reassuring for us who work in technology transfer and research as well, that there is that hunger for knowledge, and that's great to see. A reminder again, please just hold on for a few minutes just to complete the survey. That information is useful to everybody who's involved in pulling together webinars and this sort of event. So please do just take the time to do that. And a reminder about the second webinar on the 17th of June. So please take note of that as well. So thank you to the speakers. Thank you to everybody who took part tonight, and all the participants and all the people who asked questions. I think it was a really useful event. So thank you and good night.